Elevators are supposed to be predictable. You press a button, and they take you where you need to go. That's the deal. That's the unspoken contract between human and machine. So when the elevator in Brookridge Tower started defying that simple rule, I should have known something was wrong. But like most people, I ignored the warning signs until I no longer could. It started as a minor inconvenience. I had moved into the building only a week prior, and I was still getting used to the quirks of the place. The elevator sometimes took longer than expected. Occasionally, the doors hesitated before closing, as if reconsidering the journey. But that first night, when I pressed the button for the 15th floor, it took me somewhere else. I remember the way the air felt wrong as the elevator descended instead of rising. A sluggish drop, as though something was weighing it down. The number on the panel glowed, 7, but I had never pressed it. The doors slid open with an unnatural slowness, revealing a dimly lit hallway. A hallway that should have been empty. Instead, a single figure stood just beyond the threshold. A woman in a pale blue dress, her hair damp as if she had just stepped out of the rain. She made no move to enter. She didn't look at me. She just stood there, staring into the distance, her lips moving in silent conversation with someone, or something I couldn't see. A cold unease crept along my spine. I cleared my throat. "Are you coming in?" My voice sounded too loud in the small space. The woman did not react. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. The doors hesitated before closing, longer than they should have, as if waiting for her to change her mind. When it finally shut, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The elevator shuddered and continued upward, this time correctly stopping at my floor. As I stepped out, the sensation of being watched burned between my shoulder blades. But when I turned around, there was no one there. The logical part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe someone else had pressed the button for the 7th floor, and the woman was just lost in thought. Maybe I was just tired. But that night, as I lay in bed, I could still see her in my mind. The pale dress, the unmoving stare, the way her lips had moved, whispering things I couldn't hear. The next morning, I made a point to avoid the elevator. It was ridiculous, I knew, but I took the stairs instead, convincing myself it was for the exercise. But that night, as I returned from work, exhaustion won over caution. I stepped inside, pressed 15, and held my breath. This time, the elevator stopped on the 5th floor. The doors opened to complete darkness. No hallway lights, no sound of movement, nothing. Just a vast, impenetrable blackness that shouldn't have been there. And yet, standing at the threshold, I felt something was there. Waiting. I stabbed the close button repeatedly, my heartbeat a drum in my ears. The doors refused to obey at first, lingering open as if inviting something inside. Then, slowly they slid shut. The moment they sealed, a whisper brushed against my ear, soft, breathy, and impossible. Going up, the elevator jolted, climbing once more. When it reached the 15th floor and the doors opened, I ran out without looking back. My apartment door had never felt so safe. I should have taken the stairs. I told myself I was imagining things. That's what sane people do, right? They explain away the unexplainable. The mind plays tricks, exhaustion blurs reality, and sometimes old buildings just act strange. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with that elevator. The next morning, I was determined to avoid it completely. I left my apartment early, walked past the elevator without a second glance, and took the stairs. 14 flights down, my legs burning, but at least my heart wasn't pounding in terror. By the time I reached the lobby, I had almost convinced myself that the previous night had been nothing but a mix of paranoia and fatigue. That was until I saw the maintenance man. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, wearing a faded navy uniform with the Brookridge Tower logo on the chest. He stood near the elevator, arms crossed, staring at it like it had personally offended him. As I walked past, he muttered, "You should stop using that thing." I froze mid-step. His voice was low, rough, like someone who had spent years smoking or swallowing secrets. "What?" I turned to face him, but he didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the elevator doors, which gleamed under the dim fluorescent lights. "That elevator," he said, nodding toward it. "It doesn't always go where it's supposed to. It chooses. A nervous laugh slipped out before I could stop it. Elevators don't choose things. The old man finally looked at me. His eyes were sharp, too alert for someone who should be making idle small talk. "You'd be surprised," he said. "People don't listen. They never listen. But if you keep using it, you'll see." I wanted to ask what he meant, but something about the way he said it made me want to leave the building as fast as possible. I nodded awkwardly, muttered a thanks, and hurried toward the exit. But even as I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, his words stuck with me. By the time I returned home that evening, exhaustion had dulled my nerves. I stood in the lobby, staring at the elevator doors, debating whether or not I was being ridiculous. 14 flights of stairs after a long day, or one quick elevator ride. I pressed the button. As the doors opened and I stepped inside, a single thought rang in my mind. I should have listened to the warning. The ride-up was smooth at first. The soft hum of the elevator filled the small space, the glow of the buttons reflecting off the polished metal walls. I pressed 15 and watched as the numbers slowly climbed. 2, 3, 4. Everything seemed fine, normal. For a moment, I let myself relax. Maybe I really had imagined everything. Then, just as the elevator passed the 6th floor, it jerked violently. The sudden movement knocked the air from my lungs, and my hand shot out to steady myself against the wall. The lights flickered just once, but long enough to make my stomach tighten. And then the elevator stopped. The panel glowed with the number 8. My stomach sank. I hadn't pressed 8. I hadn't pressed anything but 15. A soft chime announced the arrival. The doors slid open. The hallway beyond was empty. I let out a slow breath, my pulse thudding in my ears. The floor looked just like every other in Brookridge Tower. Same beige carpet, same dim lighting, same numbered doors leading to apartments I had never seen. And yet, something felt off. Wrong. I hesitated, waiting to see if someone would step inside. No one did. The elevator didn't close immediately like it should have. It just stayed open. The seconds stretched unnaturally long. I could feel the stillness of the air, heavy and unmoving, like the building itself was holding its breath. I reached for the close button. Before I could press it, something shifted, not in the hallway, but in the elevator with me. A faint whisper of air against my neck. A change in the weight of the space. Like I was suddenly not alone. I turned around. Nothing. Swallowing hard, I jabbed the close button. The doors hesitated before finally sliding shut. As the elevator resumed its slow climb, I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened. That the pause, the air, the silence, it was all in my head. But then I saw it. The number 8 was still glowing. Even as the elevator climbed past the 9th floor, then the 10th, the button for the 8th floor remained lit, as if it had never been unpressed. As if in some way, the elevator still believed I was there. When I reached the 15th floor, I practically stumbled out, heart pounding. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see if the doors closed behind me. All I knew was that something had been waiting on the 8th floor. And maybe, just maybe, it had gotten inside. When I stepped into my apartment, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing was out of place. No windows were open. No lights flickered ominously. But the air was different, thicker somehow, like the space had been left untouched for far too long. As if I were stepping into a memory of my home rather than the real thing. I told myself it was just my nerves. The elevator incident had rattled me. That's all. I was just being paranoid. I locked the door behind me, tossed my keys on the counter, and went straight to the bathroom. Maybe a shower would clear my head. The hot water hit my skin, and for the first time that day, I let out a long breath. I closed my eyes, letting the steam surround me. The sound of the water filled the room, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against the tiles. Then it changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in pressure, a faint distortion in the sound. But within seconds, I knew something was wrong. The water no longer sounded like it was hitting the floor. Instead, it was like it was hitting something else. I forced my eyes open. For a split second, I saw it, a shadowy shape standing on the other side of the shower curtain. Tall, motionless, watching. I barely had time to react before the light flickered and the shape was gone. I stood there, my breath ragged, my skin ice-cold despite the hot water. Had I imagined it? The steam could have played tricks on my eyes. My nerves were shot from the elevator ride. That's all it was. But when I reached out to turn off the water, I noticed something impossible. The bathroom door was open. I had closed it. I was sure I had closed it. I had even locked it out of habit. And yet, there it was, slightly ajar, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, listening, straining to hear anything beyond the dripping of water. The apartment was silent. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. I stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around myself with shaky hands. I moved toward the door slowly, cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't run. I reached out, grabbed the door handle, and pushed it the rest of the way open. The hallway was empty. But now, standing in the dim light of my apartment, I was sure of one thing. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind outside, every shadow stretching across the walls sent a chill through me. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that exhaustion was making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed the moment I stepped out of that elevator. By morning, I was running on nothing but adrenaline and the bitter taste of fear. I forced myself to go through my routine, brush my teeth, make coffee, try to convince myself that my apartment felt normal again. But it didn't. It felt occupied. I avoided looking into mirrors as I got ready for work. It was a strange instinct, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I met my own reflection, I wouldn't be alone in it. Still, I had to face it eventually. I had to make sure I didn't look like a complete wreck before stepping out the door. I turned to the bathroom mirror. For a second, everything seemed fine. My own exhausted face stared back at me, dark circles under my eyes, damp hair sticking to my forehead. But as I reached for my toothbrush, my reflection didn't move. My stomach dropped. I froze, my fingers hovering over the toothbrush, but in the mirror, my reflection's hand remained at its side. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Then it smiled. Not a normal, human smile. It was wrong, stretched too wide, too slow, like it had been waiting for me to notice. And then, before I could even react, it raised its hand and waved at me. A choked noise left my throat as I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the tiled floor. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scrambled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't care about work. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of that apartment. I grabbed my bag, threw on my shoes with shaking hands, and rushed to the door. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't dare check to see if the bathroom mirror was still showing something that wasn't me. All I knew was that I needed to leave. But as I reached the hallway, something else hit me. I had only one way out. I had to take the elevator again. I stood outside my apartment door, my pulse thundering in my ears. The hallway stretched ahead, eerily quiet, the dim lighting casting long, unnatural shadows. My fingers trembled as I locked the door behind me, as if a simple deadbolt could keep out whatever was inside. But I knew better now. It wasn't the apartment that was haunted. It was me. I forced myself forward, each step echoing in the stillness. The elevator doors were just ahead, their reflective surface dull and lifeless. A part of me considered the stairs. I could run down all 15 flights if I had to. But the thought of winding stairwells, of shadowed corners where something might be waiting, made my skin crawl. No, I just had to get through the elevator ride. One ride. That was it. I pressed the call button. The soft ding that followed sent a shiver down my spine. The doors slid open immediately, as if the elevator had been expecting me. My chest tightened. Something about that was wrong. Normally, there was a slight delay, a pause before the doors opened. But this time, it hadn't even hesitated, as if it had been waiting just beyond the metal doors, knowing I would come. I stepped inside. The air felt different in here. Heavy, thick. The lights overhead hummed, casting a sterile glow over the confined space. I pressed the button for the lobby, my finger lingering on it a second longer than necessary, as if that could somehow ensure I arrived safely. The door slid shut. The elevator shuddered, but didn't move. I swallowed hard, my fingers hovering over the buttons. Was it stuck? I hit the lobby button again. Nothing. Then, slowly, the elevator began to move. But not downward. It was going up. I watched in horror as the numbers climbed. 16, 17, 18. I hadn't pressed those floors. I jabbed the stop button, my breath coming in short gasps. Nothing happened. The elevator refused to stop. Then it jerked violently, sending me stumbling against the mirrored wall. My reflection flickered in the glass, just for a second, but something about it was off. Delayed. Like I had moved first, and it had followed a fraction of a second later. The elevator stopped on floor 20. The doors slid open. I held my breath, waiting, dreading what I would see, but the hallway beyond was empty. At least, at first. Then I noticed it, something standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't moving. It wasn't facing me, but it was there, its form barely visible in the dim light. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to hit the close doors button. I didn't care where the elevator took me. Anywhere was better than here. But before I could move, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, the figure was closer. I slammed my fist against the close button, my body trembling. The doors hesitated. Another flicker, and this time, the figure stood right in front of the elevator. The doors finally shut. The elevator shuddered violently as it descended, but I barely noticed. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my entire body frozen in terror. I didn't look at the mirrored walls. I didn't check to see if my reflection was still mine. All I could do was wait, and hope the elevator took me somewhere I could escape. The descent felt endless. I gripped the metal railing, my knuckles white, my entire body rigid with fear. The air inside the elevator was heavier now, as if the space itself had shrunk, suffocating me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I tried not to think about what I had just seen, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That figure, it had been watching me, or had it. I had never seen its face, but the way it had moved or not moved was even worse. It had been there, it had been closer, then closer still, as if the darkness itself had carried it toward me. I turned away from the mirrored walls, refusing to look at my own reflection. I didn't trust it, not after what I had seen in my bathroom. The elevator continued its slow descent, the numbers flickering down one by one. 18, 17, 16. Then, the elevator stopped. I held my breath, staring at the digital display. The number 15 blinked steadily, but the doors didn't open. My stomach clenched. I hover my finger over the emergency button, hesitation making my hands slick with sweat. Then, the lights flickered again. For a brief second, I saw something, a shape, reflected in the metal doors. I wasn't alone. I spun around, pressing my back against the cold wall, my chest rising and falling rapidly. But the elevator was empty. At least it looked empty. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting to 5 in my head. When I opened them again, the lights had stabilized. The reflection in the doors showed only me, my face pale and drenched in sweat. Then, going down, a voice. I froze. The voice had come from behind me. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't turn around. The elevator jolted suddenly, sending my stomach lurching. The doors slid open. Floor 15. I didn't question it. I ran. I didn't care that I had no idea what was on this floor. I didn't care that I was stepping into the unknown. Anything was better than staying in that elevator. Because as I bolted into the hallway, just before the doors slid shut again, I saw it. In the mirrored walls of the elevator, my reflection was still standing there, watching me leave. The moment my feet hit the hallway floor, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick, humid, carrying the scent of something old, like what left to rot in a flooded basement. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the narrow corridor. My footsteps echoed in a way they shouldn't have, as if the walls were too far apart or the space wasn't quite real. I turned to look at the elevator, my pulse still hammering in my ears. The doors had already slid shut, but the reflection was still fresh in my mind. I had left. My reflection had stayed. The thought made my stomach turn, but I pushed it down. There was no going back now. The hallway stretched in both directions, identical doors lining each side. Their numbers faded as if time had erased their importance. The unsettling part, though, was the silence. The whole floor felt abandoned. Not like a floor in a normal apartment building, but like a place nobody was supposed to be in anymore. I turned right, moving cautiously. Each step I took felt too loud, like the floor was waiting to react. My fingers brushed against the wall as I walked, hoping for some sense of stability, but the wallpaper beneath my touch felt wrong. Not just old, soft, like something was moving just beneath the surface. I yanked my hand back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to keep walking, pushing forward even though every part of me screamed to turn back. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not a normal whisper. Not words I could make out, but something softer than sound. A breath against the air, a presence behind me that made the hairs on my neck stand up like needles. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Faint light spilled from within, flickering as if from a dying candle. Something wanted me to go inside. I should have run. I should have turned back, forced the elevator doors open, anything but step forward. But my feet carried me closer. And as I reached the door, my fingers trembling as I pushed it open, the light inside went out completely. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the voice from the elevator. You shouldn't be here. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was thick, almost tangible, as though the air had turned to tar around me. I could feel it pressing against my skin, seeping into my lungs with every shallow breath. I reached out instinctively, searching for a wall, a doorframe, anything solid to ground myself. My fingers met wood, the door I had just stepped through, but when I turned back to push it open again, my hands hit nothing but empty space. Panic flared in my chest. I knew I had just walked through a doorway. I had felt the door, but now there was nothing. I spun around blindly, my breathing ragged. Had the room swallowed it? Or worse, had it swallowed me? Then, the whisper returned. It wasn't behind me this time. It was everywhere. I froze. The sound wasn't just a single voice now, but many, a chorus of murmurs bleeding into one another, their meaning just out of reach. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, desperate, afraid, and they were getting closer. I forced myself to take a step forward, my hands outstretched, groping through the black void. My foot met something soft, and I recoiled. The floor hadn't been carpeted when I entered. So what was I standing on now? A flicker of light. I barely had time to register it before it vanished again, but in that split second I saw something. The walls of the room weren't smooth or empty. They were covered in faces. Not pictures, not paintings. Faces. Some had their eyes shut, others open wide in frozen terror, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They weren't alive, but they weren't just decorations either. They looked like they had been absorbed into the walls, as if the room itself had consumed them. The whispering grew louder, frantic, rising into something almost like a wail. I turned in every direction, my chest constricting. I had to get out. Now. Then, from the darkness, a hand closed around my wrist. I screamed, but before I could yank my arm away, a voice, clearer than the whispers, spoke directly into my ear. Don't move. It can't see you if you don't move. I didn't know which was worse, whatever had grabbed me or whatever it was trying to protect me from. The grip around my wrist tightened, its fingers cold and unyielding, as if it were made of stone. I barely dared to breathe, my chest constricting with terror. Every part of me screamed to yank my arm away, to flee, but the voice, asterisk asterisk low, almost soothing, asterisk asterisk spoke again. Don't move. I tried to follow the advice, though every instinct within me rebelled against it. The air around me was thick, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I strained my ears, listening for anything that would break the silence. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing but the voice and the quiet thrum of my heartbeat. It's watching. The voice continued, its tone lower now, as if struggling to be heard. Waiting for you to make a sound. I didn't dare move an inch. The grip around my wrist was all I could focus on, steady, firm, like a warning. It didn't feel human. It didn't feel alive. My mind raced with questions, but they all felt trivial in the face of the immense fear that crawled up my spine. What was this place? Who had touched me? What was out there in the dark? The whispering had stopped. In its place, something new began, a low hum, resonating through the walls, vibrating under my skin. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like a pulse. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, in my teeth, in the bones of my fingers where they touched the cold wood of the doorframe. And then, as if from nowhere, a soft rustle, barely perceptible. "Don't move." The voice was insistent now, almost panicked, and I could feel the pressure on my wrist increase, as if it were trying to drag me backward. It didn't want me to see what was coming. And then, without warning, the darkness shifted. It didn't just fade, like light fading in the morning. No, this was something different, something deliberate. The shadows themselves seemed to stretch and writhe, as though they were living, curling and spiraling toward one point. In that instant, I saw them. Two gleaming eyes. They weren't wide, like human eyes. They were elongated like slits, glowing a faint, unnatural green. They hovered just above the floor, too far down to be human, but too close to be anything else. They moved through the room, gliding effortlessly through the air, their gaze never leaving me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but the grip on my wrist wouldn't let go. I was paralyzed. The eyes blinked, slowly, deliberately. And in that moment, I realized what I was looking at wasn't just a pair of eyes. It was something else, something I didn't understand, something I couldn't grasp, no matter how much I strained to make sense of it. They were watching me. They had always been watching me. And suddenly, the hum grew louder, the pulse in the air intensifying as though it were calling out to me. And without warning, I felt myself drawn forward, against my will, toward the dark eyes. I wasn't walking. I wasn't even moving. It was as if the room itself was pulling me in. And just before I could reach the eyes, the world went black again. When the darkness finally released me, I was lying on the cold, smooth surface of the elevator floor. My head throbbed as I pushed myself up, my body trembling. I didn't know how I'd gotten back here, but the elevator doors were open, waiting for me. The hum, the whispering, the eyes, they had all vanished, leaving nothing but silence behind them. A silence so absolute it almost felt like the world had stopped moving. I glanced around the elevator, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The walls were as they had been before, the numbers on the panel glowing faintly. But something was different. The air was lighter, easier to breathe. The smell of decay that had clung to me in the dark was gone. Yet despite the calm, a nagging feeling of wrongness gnawed at the edges of my mind. I stared at the panel of buttons, at the one labeled Floor 13. I had to get out of this place. My fingers hovered over the buttons, but I hesitated. I knew better now than to trust the elevator. It never took me where I wanted to go. I pressed Floor 1. The doors slid shut, and yet, instead of moving upward, the elevator lurched downward, sending a jolt through my body. I instinctively gripped the handrail beside me, my knuckles whitening. My heart began to race. Was I back in the building? The floor indicator flickered, and the elevator halted with a grinding, mechanical scream. The number above the door blinked. -2, a basement level. The doors opened. At first, I saw nothing but the dim, flickering lights of the hallway beyond, a long, narrow corridor stretching endlessly into the darkness. The same damp, musky scent from the previous floor clung to the air, but now there was something else. A presence. It was as if the walls were alive, watching me, waiting. I stepped out into the hallway, my legs unsteady. The air was thick with anticipation, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me. My pulse quickened, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my feet continued forward, compelled by something I didn't understand. As I walked down the hall, the walls seemed to close in on me. The space felt distorted, stretched out of shape, like a funhouse mirror reflecting my every move. The sound of my footsteps echoed, but there was something odd about it. It wasn't just mine. There were other sounds, quieter, fainter, but other footsteps. I turned, heart pounding, expecting to see someone behind me. but there was nothing. The hallway extended in both directions, and I had no idea which way to go. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for some clue, some sign of where I was. The hallway to my left seemed to grow darker, while the one to my right appeared to stretch farther into the building, almost too far. I moved toward the right, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to lean in closer, their faces becoming clearer, more distinct. Some are laughing, some crying, some angry. Faces that didn't belong here, faces that seemed to beg for something, though I couldn't understand what. The hum was back. This time it wasn't distant. It was inside my head, vibrating through the very floor beneath me. I could feel it deep in my bones, rattling my teeth. It was familiar. It was the same hum I had heard in the dark room, the same hum that had surrounded me when I first felt the grip on my wrist. Then I saw it. At the end of the hall was a door. It wasn't like the others, which were just wood and plaster. This door was old, with peeling paint and rusted hinges, but it had a strange pull to it, a compulsion I couldn't ignore. I walked toward it, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my fingers trembling as I reached for the handle. The moment I touched it, the humming intensified, now a screeching noise, as if something were tearing at the fabric of the building itself. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but a pitch-black room beyond. I couldn't see inside, but the pressure, the weight in the air, was too heavy to ignore. I stepped inside. The door shut behind me with a low, reverberating thud that echoed far too long in the silence of the room. The space was so dark that I could barely make out the contours of the walls. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't just a lack of light that made it hard to see. The darkness was thick, like a heavy blanket that pressed in on all sides, stifling any attempt at clarity. The air tasted of iron, and a faint scent of decay lingered in the corners of my mouth. It was the same smell from the hallway, the same familiar weight of wrongness. I reached out, feeling the cool stone of the wall beneath my fingertips. My hand brushed against something hard, and I froze. It wasn't a wall. It was a table. A small, metal table, cold to the touch, with dark stains dotting its surface. I recoiled, stumbling backward as my mind filled with questions. Why was it here? What had happened in this room? Suddenly, the air around me shifted, and I felt a chill race up my spine. It wasn't just the temperature that dropped. It was something deeper, something unnatural, something that couldn't be explained by physics or logic. A whisper stirred in the room, faint but unmistakable. You shouldn't be here. The voice was low, almost a murmur, but it carried an edge of something ancient, a warning, a command. I couldn't tell where it came from. There were no visible figures, no shadows creeping at the edge of my vision. It felt like the voice was inside my head, rather than spoken aloud. And then, as quickly as it came, the whisper faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I tried to move again, but my legs were heavy, as if the room itself was holding me in place. Every step felt as though I were wading through something thick and sticky, each foot dragging behind the other. The urge to leave was growing stronger, an instinctual pull deep in my gut, but I couldn't tear myself away. I reached into my pocket for my phone, desperate for any source of light, any connection to the outside world. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the immediate area around me with its dim glow. As I raised it higher, I caught a glimpse of something etched into the stone wall opposite me. Scratches crude and jagged, carved into the surface as if someone had desperately tried to escape. The markings were erratic, almost frantic, but there was something else written there as well, something I couldn't read at first. But as my eyes adjusted, I made out the familiar shapes of letters. It was a word, or perhaps a name, written over and over, smeared in what I could only hope was ink. Help me. The words seemed to pulse with a strange energy, their meaning too powerful to ignore. Help me. Help me. Help me. They repeated, as though they were trying to claw their way into my mind, desperate for attention, for rescue. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Whoever had been in this room before me, they hadn't escaped. They were still here. I turned away from the wall, the words echoing in my head, and for the first time since entering the room, I felt uneasy. The air around me seemed thicker now, almost suffocating. I could hear a faint noise, scratching, coming from somewhere to my left. At first, I thought it was just the settling of the building, but the sound continued, growing louder, closer. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. In the corner of the room, a shape was emerging from the shadows, slowly, steadily, like it was rising from the floor itself. It was indistinct at first, a blur, but as it came into focus, I could make out the form of a figure, humanoid but not quite human. Its body was twisted, contorted in ways that no living thing should be able to move. The arms stretched far too long, the head cocked at an unnatural angle. It was wrong, in every possible way. The scratching sound continued, this time coming from the creature itself. It was shifting, crawling toward me with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black, voids that seemed to consume the surrounding light, as if nothing would ever escape their gaze. In that moment, I understood. It was not alive, and it had never been alive. It was something that had been left behind, something that had been abandoned in this place, forgotten and imprisoned in the dark. And now, it was reaching for me, just like it had reached for the person who had carved their final plea into the wall. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. But somehow, I knew I had to act. I had to get out of here before it reached me. The creature's movements were unervingly methodical, as though it was learning, adapting with every second that passed. Each inch it crawled toward me seemed to stretch out an eternity. Its arms were grotesquely long, trailing behind it as if they were weighted, scraping against the stone floor in a rhythmic, haunting noise. I backed away, slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. Yet a voice inside my head told me there was no way out. I had been in this elevator for too long. The building had swallowed me whole, dragged me into its depths, and now I could feel it, the grip of the elevator. The sensation was a gnawing pressure in my chest, like invisible hands tightening around my ribs. The walls seemed to lean in, and the air became heavier with each passing moment. I wasn't in control anymore. The creature, too, seemed to sense it. It paused for a brief moment, its head cocked to the side, and then it tilted back and opened its mouth, a grotesque stretch of skin, too wide to be natural. The air was filled with the sound of clicking, like the sound of 1,000 insects crawling under the skin of the room. My heart raced. What was it trying to do? Why was it listening? Then I felt it. There was an almost imperceptible pull from the floor, the ground beneath me suddenly shifting. The sensation was subtle at first, like the building had just let out a breath, but it was unmistakable. Something was happening to the room itself, its dimensions, its structure. The scratching creature continued toward me, but now it moved as if dragged, its body sliding unnaturally across the floor with no regard for its grotesque limbs. I had only moments before it reached me, before the darkness in its eyes swallowed my every sense of reality. My fingers fumbled for my phone again, but this time, it didn't flicker to life. The screen remained black, mocking me. I had no escape. My breath became shallow as the walls around me groaned, creaking like an old house on the verge of collapse. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, and I stumbled forward, only to find the ground beneath me give way. The room was shifting again, distorting, as if the very architecture of this place had never been meant to stay the same. I had to find something, anything to defend myself. My eyes scanned the room frantically, landing on the table I had passed earlier. It was small, insignificant even, but it was all I had. Gripping the edge with both hands, I lifted it as best I could, the weight almost too much for me to manage. But I had to try. The creature didn't hesitate. Its head snapped to me, the mouth still wide in that unnatural grin as it pushed itself up with those twisted limbs, its body unervingly fluid. I swung the table toward it, praying for some kind of impact, but the creature sidestepped with impossible speed, its movements unervingly human in a way that made my stomach churn. The floor under my feet shifted again. The table I had been using for support suddenly cracked down the middle, splintering into sharp fragments. Panic flooded me. The creature didn't even flinch as the table collapsed beneath its weight. It was as though it had never been there, like it didn't matter. Then, just as the creature moved closer, a noise broke through the tension, a loud, resounding thump from somewhere deep within the room. It was followed by another, then another, a rhythm of sounds that echoed across the space. The creature froze, its head twisting in the direction of the noise. I didn't understand what was happening, but it wasn't the first time I'd felt the pull of something unseen, something that commanded attention. The creature recoiled, its body jerking backward as if something far greater than itself was making a claim on the room. I watched in disbelief as its form began to waver, to flicker. The creature itself seemed to blur, as if it were no longer fully real, like it was a projection, a figment of the building's twisted imagination. Then it vanished entirely, leaving behind only the scent of decay, the echoes of its scraping limbs, and the sensation of something deep in the walls, something ancient, stirring again. I was left alone in the silence, but not for long. Something had changed. The building was awake. For a brief moment, everything seemed still. The room, once pulsing with an unnatural energy, had returned to its oppressive silence. My chest, which had been tight with fear, now throbbed with a strange sense of both relief and foreboding. The creature was gone, but something far more unsettling had taken its place. The walls around me felt alive, as if the very building itself was watching, listening, waiting for something to unfold. I stood frozen in the center of the room, unsure of how to move forward. The flickering light from my phone was the only illumination, but it felt weak, almost inconsequential in the face of this overwhelming darkness. I didn't know what had just happened. The creature was gone, but the sense of wrongness still lingered in the air. I could feel it crawling under my skin, tugging at the edges of my sanity. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything felt wrong, as if the boundaries of the room had shifted, as if the room itself were no longer part of the world I once knew. I took a tentative step forward, then another, but the ground seemed to undulate beneath me, as if it were shifting in response to my movements. My footsteps left no echo. There was only the silence, the kind of silence that made every movement feel like a trespass. It was as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. As I made my way toward the door, the sense of dread only intensified. Something was pulling at me from inside the room, from the walls themselves. The whispers I had heard earlier, the ones that seemed to have no origin, now returned. They were faint, distant, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't be here," the voice echoed in my mind. "Leave, before it's too late." I froze, panic rising in my chest. Was the building alive? Was it trying to tell me something? There was no logic that could explain what was happening, no reasoning that could make sense of the twisted events unfolding. The creature had vanished, but it had left a mark, an imprint on the very fabric of this place. I was no longer in a building. I was inside something else entirely, something ancient, something forgotten. The walls seemed to tighten around me. The air thickened with a kind of pressure, an invisible weight pressing against my chest. It was as if the space was closing in, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. The floor beneath me felt unstable, as though the building were shifting in some otherworldly manner, one that defied natural laws. My mind raced for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of this nightmare, but I was lost. There was no explanation, only a feeling that something was closing in. I pressed my hand to the cold surface of the door, my fingers trembling as I attempted to turn the handle. It didn't budge. The door was locked. It was as if the building itself had sealed me in, trapping me in its own twisted reality. My heart began to pound in my chest as I tried again, pulling desperately on the handle, but it refused to give. This was no ordinary lock. This was something deliberate, something designed to keep me here. My thoughts spiraled into chaos as I backed away from the door. I had to find another way out. There had to be something. The elevator buttons? No, they were useless. I had already tried that. The walls? The floor? They had to hold some secret, some way out of this nightmare. The sense of being trapped, in both a physical and psychological sense, was beginning to overwhelm me. I needed to think clearly, but the mounting pressure in the room was making it nearly impossible to focus. And then, just as I was about to lose myself to the panic, I heard it. A soft, distant hum, the faintest vibration underfoot. It was unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the hum of electricity or the sound of machinery. It was deep, like something buried in the foundation of the building itself, something that had been asleep for a long time and was now beginning to stir. I sank to the floor, my hands trembling as I pressed them to the cold stone beneath me. The hum was growing louder, vibrating through the very bones of the building. I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth, in the very marrow of my bones. It was as if the walls, the floors, the elevator itself were all alive, each part of the building awakening with a terrible consciousness. The room was no longer just a physical space. It was something else entirely. A being, a living, breathing organism. And it was waking up. The hum intensified, the vibrations now coursing through my body like an electrical current. I felt it in my fingertips, my legs, the very core of my being. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, an almost tangible force that seemed to reverberate through the structure itself. The building was alive, and it was aware of me. This thought pierced through the fog of panic clouding my mind. The building had never been a simple structure of stone and steel. It was a living entity, a creature in its own right, and it had been waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to awaken it. The walls shifted again, but this time it was different. There was a subtle but unmistakable change in the atmosphere, as if the very air had thickened, become denser, and as I breathed in, I could taste it. A strange, metallic tang filled my mouth, and I nearly gagged as I struggled to catch my breath. The heartbeat of the building reverberated through the walls, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just the hum. It was a pulse, a rhythmic thumping that mirrored the beat of a heart. I looked up at the ceiling, half expecting to see the dark shape of the creature return. But there was nothing. There was only the silence, the pulse, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The walls around me began to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with the heartbeat. They seemed to swell, pushing outward as if they were drawing in air, then contracting again, as if exhaling. I could feel the tension building in the room, a palpable pressure that seemed to push down on me, urging me to succumb to its pull. I forced myself to stand, though every inch of my body screamed at me to run. The floor beneath me felt like it was moving, shifting in response to the pulse of the building's heart. I tried to walk, but my steps were uncertain, disjointed, as if I were moving through a dream. The elevator shaft had stopped being a simple lift between floors. It had become something far worse. It was a conduit, a vessel for something ancient, something that no longer belonged in this world. As the building's pulse quickened, so did the oppressive feeling of claustrophobia that consumed me. My chest tightened, my throat constricted, and every breath felt like I was inhaling more of the building's essence, more of the thing that lived within these walls. The lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that stretched across the floor and walls like dark fingers reaching toward me. I couldn't help but feel that these shadows were alive, that they were extensions of the building's growing awareness of my presence. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "You're too close now," they said, their voices indistinct and yet somehow familiar. "You should have left." It wasn't a warning. It was an accusation, a judgment. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the voices. Were they the building's consciousness? Or had they been here all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The whispers seemed to coil around me, filling my ears, my head, until they became a maddening cacophony of sound. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. The heartbeat of the building pulsed in time with the whispers, a terrible rhythm that was impossible to escape. The floor beneath me began to buckle, the walls creaking as if they were alive, as if they were breathing with me, feeding off of my fear. Suddenly, the lights went out. A suffocating darkness descended, enveloping the room in an instant. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The whispers stopped, replaced by a sound far worse. A scratching like something large and heavy was dragging itself along the floor, coming closer, inch by inch. The building was alive, but now it felt as if something else was within it, something that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting to break free. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of light, but when I turned it on, the screen remained black. The battery was dead. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to steady my breathing, but it was impossible. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing more suffocating by the second. I tried to move, to find any exit, but the room seemed to stretch out endlessly. I was trapped in a maze of darkness, a labyrinth of the building's own design. The scratching grew louder, and then from the depths of the blackness, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not the familiar, dull thud of human feet, but something heavier, something more deliberate. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming toward me. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was getting closer, the thumping of the steps matching the rhythm of the building's heartbeat. It was as if the building itself was guiding whatever it was to me, urging it forward. And then I heard it, the voice. This time, it was clear, direct. You're part of it now. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The building had claimed me. There is a truth about fear that no one tells you before you experience it. It's not just the terror that seizes your body, locking it in place. It's not the cold sweat that pours down your spine, nor the pounding heart that threatens to burst from your chest. It's the way fear manipulates your mind, twists your perception, and shapes reality into something unrecognizable. The walls of this building no longer felt like simple barriers. They had become something else entirely, living entities with motives of their own. And they were whispering to me, beckoning me into the darkest corners of my mind. When the lights had gone out, I had hoped that it was just another malfunction, another of the elevator's tricks. But as I stood there, in the suffocating darkness, trying to regain some semblance of control over my senses, I began to hear it. The whispers. At first, they were faint, distant murmurs, as if coming from far away. But they grew louder, clearer, until they surrounded me. There was no escaping them. They were everywhere, in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It felt like the very air itself was alive, breathing, watching. The whispers were not mere sounds. They were words. Each syllable pierced through the darkness like a blade, their meaning shifting with every passing second. At times, they were soothing, almost gentle, as if trying to lull me into a false sense of security. At others, they were sharp, urgent, like an accusation I couldn't quite understand. And amidst the chaos, I began to hear my own name, whispered in a voice that felt eerily familiar, as if it were coming from within me. "You're not alone," they said. "We've been waiting for you." The words sent a chill crawling down my spine. My body reacted before my mind could process the meaning. I staggered backward, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The walls, once inanimate structures, felt like they were alive, pulsing with each beat of the building's heart. It was as if the walls themselves were feeding on my fear, growing stronger, more insistent. The sound of their whispers became overwhelming, an incessant flood that drowned out everything else. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices were inside my head now, rooted deep within me. I stumbled toward the elevator buttons, desperate to find some way to stop the madness. But there were no buttons anymore. The panel had disappeared, replaced by a smooth, black surface that seemed to stretch on forever. There was no escape. The building was not just trapping me in its corridors, it was manipulating me, twisting my reality to its will. Everything I knew, everything I believed, was being reshaped by the whispers. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was just imagining things. This was all just a dream, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The very air seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the heartbeat beneath my feet, and the whispers grew louder. My fingers brushed the walls, and a strange sensation shot through my hand. A jolt of cold, sharp energy that made my whole body stiffen. It wasn't like anything I had ever felt before. It was as though the walls themselves had a presence, a soul, and they were reaching out to me. The whispers began to shift again, becoming more intelligible. "You shouldn't have come," they said. "You're part of us now." My stomach twisted as I felt the weight of the words. This was no longer a random malfunction of the elevator. This was deliberate. The building wanted me here. It had been waiting for me, guiding me, drawing me closer to the heart of its labyrinthine structure. I could feel it now, the presence that watched me from every corner, every shadow. The thing that lived within the walls, feeding off the fear it created, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I was not alone. I had never been alone. I turned in a circle, trying to find something, anything that could help me understand what was happening. But the darkness was overwhelming, and the whispers had become a low hum, a constant undercurrent to the chaos in my mind. It was as if the very walls themselves were talking to me, whispering secrets that I could never understand. I ran my hands along the smooth surface of the elevator, feeling the cold of the metal, the slickness of the strange substance coating it. There was something almost organic about it now, something that made my skin crawl. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, oppressive. I waited, holding my breath, listening for the next sound, the next whisper. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard something far worse, a scratching sound, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the building, somewhere below me. The scraping noise grew louder, closer, until it was directly beneath me, beneath the elevator's floor. My heart raced again, my mind fighting to stay coherent as the scraping continued, relentless, deafening. "You should have left when you had the chance." The voice was different now, more malevolent, as if it had grown stronger, angrier. I pressed myself against the wall, feeling the cold, slick surface beneath my fingertips. But it didn't feel like metal anymore. It felt like flesh, soft and yielding, yet somehow unyielding at the same time. The walls were alive. The building had been waiting for me all along. I had spent what felt like an eternity trapped within the building's ever-changing maze. The walls, alive, pulsating with some malevolent energy, had twisted the elevator into something unrecognizable. The once innocuous ride had become a twisted prison of terror. But it wasn't just the whispers, nor the cold, clammy feeling of the elevator's walls that had taken hold of me. No, it was something far worse, the mirror. I didn't understand it at first. There hadn't been a mirror in the elevator, at least not in any of the floors I'd passed. But as I stumbled aimlessly, clutching the walls for some sense of reality, I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim light, some flicker in the darkness. But the more I looked, the more it became undeniable. The mirror hung against the far wall, reflecting a reality that seemed at odds with the world around me. It was a smooth surface, gleaming despite the darkness, without a single crack or blemish. It wasn't a part of the elevator. I was certain of that. It was as if it had materialized from the very walls themselves. A window to another world, perhaps, or some twisted reflection of my own fear. I approached it cautiously, my footsteps muffled against the smooth, eerily quiet floor. I reached out, hesitant, but something compelled me to do so. The surface of the mirror was cold, colder than the elevator had ever been. And yet, as I touched it, a sharp twinge of warmth surged through me. I recoiled for a moment, unsure of what to do. But curiosity, that old, fatal flaw, pushed me forward once again. I leaned in closer, my reflection staring back at me. At first, it was just a reflection. My face looked pale, haggard, exhausted from the stress of my ordeal. But then something began to shift. The reflection began to morph, subtly at first, until my face no longer resembled my own. My features blurred, replaced with someone else, someone familiar. It was me, but it wasn't. The figure in the mirror was no longer a reflection of me as I had known myself. The eyes, those deep, hollow sockets, were staring at me with a strange, predatory intensity. The mouth twisted into a grin, wide and unnaturally stretched, and I could hear a faint laugh echoing from the depths of the mirror. It was a laugh that sounded far too familiar. My laugh, yet it wasn't mine at all. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection, if you could even call it that, began to move on its own. My reflection in the mirror wasn't merely a static image anymore. It was alive, shifting and twisting in ways I couldn't comprehend. The figure seemed to step out from the glass itself, as if it were no longer confined by the limitations of the reflective surface. It was as if the mirror had opened up a rift to another version of reality. I could feel it then, creeping up behind me, the sensation of something wrong, unnervingly wrong, as though I had just stepped into a world where the rules didn't apply, where nothing made sense. The temperature around me dropped sharply, the air thick with a suffocating, oppressive energy. The mirror's surface rippled, like disturbed water, distorting the figure even more. And just as I thought it couldn't get worse, the figure spoke. You knew this was coming. The voice was not mine. It was twisted, echoing through the depths of the mirror like an ancient echo from somewhere I couldn't place. The words rattled in my skull, bouncing off the walls, reverberating in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I felt the walls close in again, the very structure of the elevator responding to the dark forces at play. I staggered back again, heart pounding in my chest. How was this possible? What was this thing, this reflection, that seemed so alive? And why did it feel like it knew things about me that I hadn't even come to terms with myself? The mirror distorted once more, and the figure began to speak again. You've always been part of this place. You just didn't want to see it. The voice was now cold, dripping with some kind of ancient knowledge. The laughter returned, echoing, mocking me, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the mirror was not showing me some distant reflection of myself, but was instead showing me the truth, a truth I had been unwilling to face. In that moment, I realized the horrible, twisted truth. The building wasn't just alive. It had been waiting for me. Not just for anyone, but for me. The very fabric of this place, its existence, had been linked to mine all along. The elevator, the walls, the mirror, they were all pieces of the same dark puzzle. And I was the key. I reached out toward the mirror again, this time without hesitation, determined to face whatever this was. But as my fingers brushed the glass, the reflection of my hand stopped moving, and instead, it was replaced with a vision of the past. My past. I saw myself as a child, walking through these same halls. I saw glimpses of rooms I had forgotten, rooms that shouldn't have been in this building at all. And in the distance, I saw the shadowed figure of someone I knew too well, someone I tried so desperately to forget. The person in the reflection was me, but also not me. The building was showing me what I had buried deep inside. It was showing me that I had always belonged here, and now it would never let me leave. The elevator, that once feared metal box, had become an extension of my own mind. I had thought that the walls could close in on me, that the mirrored reflection had revealed the ultimate truth, but in reality, the true horror lay in the way the elevator seemed to bend to the will of the place itself. No longer simply a vessel that transported me from floor to floor, it had become a living entity, part of the puzzle that held me trapped within this nightmarish realm. As I stood before the mirror, trying to make sense of the shifting, ghostly image of myself, I began to feel something deep inside me unravel. The weight of the truth, of the realization that this building, this elevator, and everything that had happened had been leading to this moment felt as though it were pressing down on my chest. The air grew thick, suffocating, the walls now feeling more like an extension of my body, an oppressive, twisted extension of my own thoughts. My breaths were shallow, my thoughts tangled and twisted, each one getting caught in the labyrinth of my own fear. The mirror had shown me the past, but it hadn't just shown me the life I had lived. It had shown me the life I had buried. Every choice, every moment, every turn I had taken had led me to this elevator, to this place. The strange echo of laughter still hung in the air, a constant reminder of the thing that was now sharing this space with me. Was it me? Was it the building? Was it something far worse? I couldn't be sure anymore. As the elevator jolted to life, the doors snapped shut and the familiar hum of the machinery resumed. But nothing felt the same. The feeling of descent, once comforting in its predictability, now seemed endless. There was no clear destination, no reassurance that this ride would end. The floors no longer existed in any tangible sense. They were simply markers, points on a map that didn't belong in the real world. I pressed the button for a floor, hoping for any kind of indication that the elevator was still working as it once had. The panel lit up, but the numbers stopped moving, frozen in time. The ride felt like a slow, torturous spiral, one that wasn't bound to any floor or building but to some dark, cosmic abyss. I could feel myself sinking deeper into the depths, as if the elevator were a vessel, drawing me toward something. My heart raced, my palms clammy as I grasped the railing. The usual logic of travel, of floors, of rooms, no longer applied. Each moment I spent in this moving tomb was a disorienting descent, as though the laws of space and time were being bent at the will of some unseen force. I turned my head away from the mirror, trying to break the cycle of looking into it. But it was no use. The mirror had become an anchor, drawing my gaze back every time I tried to look away. The reflection now warped and twisted, showing me impossible versions of myself. In one, I was older, graying, wrinkled, my body showing the wear of years that had never truly passed. In another, I was young again, filled with the bright, naive energy I had once had, but there was an emptiness behind my eyes that made the child version of me unrecognizable. The whispering came again, like an insidious voice of reason, soft and seductive, but filled with something darker. "You can't escape this," it whispered, as if the building itself were breathing through the walls. "This is where you belong." It wasn't just the reflection or the elevator that was watching me. It was the very structure of the building itself, its heart beating in tandem with mine. Suddenly, the elevator lurched to a stop, and I felt a sharp chill as the lights flickered once more. I tried pressing the buttons again, but they were unresponsive. The feeling of hopelessness crept in slowly, but it was overpowering, like the weight of the world pressing down on me. There were no more floors, no more destinations. I wasn't ascending, nor descending. I was stuck, lost in a void of my own making. The elevator was no longer a vehicle to escape, but a prison. The walls, though solid, felt liquid, shifting and undulating like something alive. I reached out to touch the walls again, this time feeling a strange, pulsating energy beneath the surface. It was as if the building was aware of me, attuned to my every movement. Each breath I took seemed to echo through the structure, and I couldn't help but feel that this place was alive. More alive than I was. I collapsed to the floor, overcome with a dizzying sense of despair. How'd I gotten here? This building, this cursed, twisted elevator, had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in my life. And now, it was the final destination, the only place left where I could confront my fate. My mind raced through the fragments of my memories, through the choices I had made that had led me to this moment. But there was nothing to hold on to. The past, the present, and even the future had become blurry, indistinct. In that moment, a realization struck me with brutal clarity. I was never meant to leave. The elevator wasn't a tool of escape. It wasn't an instrument of travel. It was a trap, a place where the echoes of the past, the ghosts of my own failures, and the secrets I had kept buried were all woven together into a single, endless descent. The only way out was to face it, to confront whatever dark truth I had been avoiding. But the longer I stayed in the elevator, the more I realized there was no escape, no way to outrun the truth. The building had won. The elevator was still, unmoving. The sudden absence of the usual hum was deafening. For a moment, I thought it might have finally stopped functioning entirely. After all, how long had it been since the last time it had moved? How long had I been stuck, spiraling through time and space with no clear destination. But the stillness didn't offer any comfort. Instead, it was like the calm before a storm, an ominous silence that weighed heavier than anything else I had experienced. I could feel the walls pressing in once more. The air in the elevator had thickened, suffocating, as though something immense was waiting just outside the door. The strange, icy coldness that had once enveloped the space now felt more intimate, as though it had seeped into my very bones. There was no escape from it. There had never been an escape from it. The mirror, still reflecting my image, now seemed different. Not just altered, but changed. My reflection didn't look quite like me anymore. It was distorted, fractured in ways I couldn't quite understand. The face staring back at me wore an expression of pure dread, but it wasn't my dread. It was a fear that was older than I could comprehend, a terror tied to this place, this elevator. I couldn't look away, though, not anymore. The image held me in place, as if I were tethered to it. The floors, the buttons, the lights, none of it made sense anymore. The elevator had ceased to function as I knew it. It was no longer a vessel for travel, but rather a prison, a container for something far worse. The buttons no longer lit up when pressed, the display frozen in time, showing an endless list of floors that no longer had meaning. They were just numbers, symbols, meaningless signs of a journey that would never be complete. There was no indication of where we were anymore, no guidance on where we were going, or even if there was a destination left at all. I couldn't help but wonder, had I always been here? Had I ever really left the elevator? Or had it always been my prison? Had I imagined the floors, the corridors, the other moments of my life as I had lived them? Or was everything I had ever known just another layer of illusion created by the building, this unholy structure that had trapped me for what felt like eternity? Suddenly, a new sensation filled the space, one that sent my heart into overdrive. Something was changing. I felt the elevator tremble beneath me, a violent shaking that made the walls seem to warp and bend. The air grew hotter, like a furnace being stoked, and then the elevator jolted into motion once more. But this time, it didn't move in a linear fashion. There was no up or down, no clear direction. The elevator whirled, as though caught in a vortex. I could feel myself being pulled in all directions, my stomach lurching as the world around me twisted and distorted. The mirror flickered again, and this time I could see something else. Not just my reflection, but other images, other faces. They were blurred at first, but then they slowly came into focus. People I had never met, people I didn't recognize, but whose eyes stared back at me with an expression of unmistakable familiarity. They were like ghosts or fragments of memories that didn't belong to me. They reached out, their hands pressing against the glass, as if trying to pull me through. A faint whisper echoed in my mind. "You're not alone." I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, trying to focus on something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. But the more I tried, the more the elevator seemed to warp, bending and twisting in on itself. It felt like the world was collapsing. The fabric of reality itself was beginning to tear apart, and I was trapped at the epicenter of it. I could feel it all, the weight of the past, the pressure of the present, and the gnawing terror of the future. The elevator continued its journey, but I no longer knew what it was doing. There was no up, no down, no logic to its movement. I closed my eyes, hoping for it all to stop, hoping to escape the chaos. When I opened them again, everything had changed. The walls were gone, the floor beneath me had disappeared, and I was standing in the void. It wasn't dark. It was something far worse. It was an endless, suffocating gray, a place without definition, without form, like I was trapped in the space between worlds. The elevator had taken me somewhere I could not name, somewhere beyond the reach of logic and reason. And the worst part was that I couldn't tell if I had truly arrived anywhere at all. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe properly. I was frozen in place, like an insect trapped in amber, caught in the moment between life and death. Had I crossed over? Had I died without even realizing it? My mind struggled to process what was happening, but there was nothing to grasp onto, nothing to hold. The elevator, the space, it all felt like a dream or a nightmare or maybe some kind of eternal limbo. The last thought I had as I stood there, suspended in the void, was that perhaps the elevator had never really been the problem at all. Maybe it wasn't the elevator that had trapped me. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was my own mind, my own soul that had become entangled in the building's twisted web. The walls of the elevator, the floors, the endless ride, they had been nothing more than a reflection of my inner turmoil, a manifestation of my own fear, my own desire to escape the truth. I didn't know if I would ever leave this place, or if I was meant to stay here forever. But the one thing I did know, the only thing I was certain of, was that I was no longer in control. As the last remnants of my grip on reality slipped away, I had come to realize something both freeing and terrifying. The elevator was not just a machine, but a reflection, a mirror into my deepest fears, my failures, my inability to escape myself. Each floor I had visited, each jolt of the elevator, each twist in the journey, none of it had ever been about the building. It was about me, the person trapped inside, trapped by my own decisions, my own choices, my own refusal to confront the truth. It wasn't the elevator's fault. It wasn't the building that was malfunctioning. It was my mind, warped by years of denying the inevitable. I had been looking for an escape in the wrong places. I had thought I could outrun the past, ignore the consequences of my actions, and somehow emerge unscathed. But the elevator had always known. It had always been there, waiting for me to understand. And now, that understanding was crashing down on me like a tidal wave. The truth was inescapable. The light flickered once more, its dim glow illuminating the darkness that surrounded me. The empty gray space had slowly shifted, and now I could see it more clearly. There were no walls, no ceiling, no floor. There was only nothingness, a vast, endless void that stretched far beyond what my mind could fathom. And within this void, I stood alone. The figures in the mirror, the ones I had seen before, were gone, their faces replaced by my own reflection. But this time, there was no fear. There was only acceptance. I had spent so long running from the past, hiding in the comfort of the elevator's movements. But now, as I stood in the heart of the void, I realized something that chilled me to the core. The elevator had never been a trap. It had been a way out of the delusion I had built around myself, a way out of the lie I had been living. But I had refused to face the truth. Instead, I had allowed the elevator to carry me further and further from reality, deeper into a place where there was no escape. I had been trapped in my own mind. And yet, now, the elevator had stopped. No more floors to visit, no more numbers to press, no more distractions. I had come to the end of the line. The world around me seemed to pulsate with the weight of everything I had ignored, everything I had tried to bury. The voices, the faces, the whispers, they all came rushing back, reminding me of the choices I had made, the paths I had chosen, the people I had hurt, the chances I had thrown away, and the fear I had been too stubborn to face. In that silence, I realized that I had always been the one to keep the elevator moving. It wasn't the machine that was in control, but me. I had pressed the buttons, I had chosen the floors, and I had allowed myself to spiral further into the abyss. I had been the one to trap myself, the one to allow the fear of facing the truth to keep me locked in this endless cycle. The elevator had merely been the vehicle, but the true prison had been my own mind. The realization struck me with the force of a thunderclap, but instead of shattering me, it freed me. For the first time in what felt like eternity, I could see clearly. The illusion of control, the illusion of safety within the confines of the elevator, it had all been a lie. I had been running from everything that could have saved me. The truth was simple and terrifying. There was no escape for myself. But that realization, as horrifying as it was, also gave me something I had never had before: clarity. I took a deep breath, or at least I tried to. It didn't feel like air, but I could feel it fill my lungs, an action that somehow grounded me in this otherwise disorienting space. The space had changed, and with it, I felt a shift in myself. The elevator's journey was over, but mine was not. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something new, something I had never anticipated. I had come face to face with my own worst fears, and in doing so, I had shattered them. The void began to fade, its vastness shrinking as though the walls of the elevator were slowly reappearing. I could see the floor beneath my feet now, feel its solid presence, grounding me. The air, once suffocating, began to clear. The distorted mirror, the broken walls, the flickering lights, all of it started to take shape again, though this time, I could see them for what they were. They were not things to fear. They were only reflections. Reflections of the past, of decisions I had made, but nothing more. They no longer held power over me. The elevator's doors creaked open, revealing nothing but more of the same gray emptiness. I stepped forward cautiously, hesitating for a moment. But there was no hesitation in my heart anymore. The fear, the anxiety, the panic, I had confronted it all, and in doing so, I had conquered it. The door was not just an exit from the elevator. It was an exit from the prison I had built for myself. As I stepped into the unknown, I no longer wondered where the elevator would take me next. Because the truth was clear now. I had always been in control. I had always been able to choose the next step. And this time I was ready. Ready to leave behind the fear, the uncertainty, and the confusion. Ready to move forward. Ready to face the world. My world for the first time in a long while. And with that final thought, I stepped out into the light.